I remember the exact morning it all began to unravel. Not because the day was special, but because it was so painfully ordinary. It was Tuesday, April 12th, 1983. A Tuesday. The air outside held that particular late spring chill we get in this part of the country, the kind that promises warmth but doesn't deliver, leaving a slick of frost on the north-facing window panes. I remember the light in the kitchen was thin, the color of weak tea, and it made the worn pattern on the linoleum look even more tired. I was sitting at the table, the one my husband Daniel had built from 2 planks of solid oak, and I was stirring sugar into my coffee. I can still feel the specific grit of the sugar against the ceramic mug, a slow, scraping sound in the quiet house. That's when I saw the headlights of a new truck turn into my lane, a truck too shiny and proud for the muddy ruts of a working farm. It was my brother-in-law, Silas. He parked it right in front of the porch, like he owned the place. Turns out, he thought he did. He didn't come in for coffee. He stood on the bottom step, his hands in his pockets, and told me the bank had finalized the paperwork. The farm, all 120 acres of it, was legally his. He said Daniel had signed it over to him back in '77, a few months before the heart attack took him. He said it was a private arrangement to settle some old debts. He was just being decent, he said, giving me all these years to get myself situated. Now he needed to liquidate. He gave me 30 days. 30. By the way, wherever in the world you're watching from right now, let me know in the comments. I love seeing how far these stories reach. Okay, where were we? Right, 30 days. He said it so plainly, like he was telling me the time. He wasn't cruel about it, not in his tone. That was Silas's way. He'd deliver the killing blow with a calm, reasonable voice that made you feel like you were the one being difficult for bleeding out on his good shoes. He pulled a folded piece of paper from his coat, a photocopy of a deed with a signature at the bottom that was supposed to be my husband's. It looked right at a glance, but it felt wrong. It felt like a lie the size of a mountain. I didn't say much. I just stood there in the doorway, the screen door between us, my coffee getting cold in my hand. He told me he'd have his lawyer send the official notice. Then he got back in his shiny truck and drove away, leaving a cloud of dust to settle over my primroses. The difficult ground wasn't the soil, not this time. I knew how to read that. I knew the low spot in the west pasture that held water too long in the spring, and the sandy ridge on the north 40 that needed more manure than it was worth. I'd walked every acre of this place with Daniel. We'd bought it in 1958, the year after we were married. It was a wreck then, the fences down and the barn leaning so hard, a strong wind would have put it out of its misery. We put it right, together. 30 years of work, of worry, of small triumphs. Daniel's father had farmed the next property over, and he'd left Daniel a piece of advice I never forgot. He said, "Some folks inherit land. The smart ones inherit the ledger." Daniel took that to heart. My husband was not a man of many words, but he was a man of meticulous record. Every seed purchase, every vet bill, every gallon of gas for the tractor, every bushel of corn sold and for how much. It all went into a series of simple, cloth-bound account books. He kept them on a shelf in the small room we called the office, which was really just a glorified closet with a desk. After Silas left, that's the first place I went. I stood in that little room, the air thick with the smell of old paper and dust, and I looked at the shelf. The books for the last few years were there, but the older ones, the ones from the '70s, were gone. I remembered, in the fog of grief after Daniel died in the fall of '77, Silas had come over to quote one. He said he was just getting Daniel's affairs in order for me, boxing up old papers to make space. He was so helpful, so considerate. He must have taken them then. A cold dread, colder than the morning frost, started to creep up my spine. For 6 years, I'd been running the farm on a shoestring, leasing out the big fields and managing the house and the garden myself. I'd always felt like I was treading water, and now I knew why. Silas had been waiting for the right moment to pull the plug. He knew that without Daniel's records, it was just my word against his piece of paper. And in the eyes of the law, paper beats memory every time. I sank into Daniel's old chair, the leather cracked and worn smooth where his hands used to rest. I could almost hear his quiet voice, repeating a maxim he'd written on the inside cover of his first ledger, a line I'd seen 100 times. Ink doesn't forget, but it waits for good light to be read. The problem was, all my ink was gone. The years between Daniel's death and Silas's visit had been a blur of survival. Grief is a thief of time. It steals days, weeks, months. You wake up and a season has passed without your consent. I had my friend Evelyn, who lived down the road. She'd lost her husband a decade before, and she knew the landscape of widowhood. I called her that afternoon, my voice flatter than I intended. I told her what Silas had done. She was quiet for a long time on the other end of the line. Evelyn wasn't one for platitudes or outrage. Her mind worked like a good engine, always turning over the practical parts of a problem. "Martha," she said finally, "did you ever see this paper he talks about, back then?" I told her no, I hadn't. "Did Daniel ever talk about being in debt to Silas?" she asked. "Never," I said. "It was always the other way around. Daniel loaned him money more times than I can count. Small amounts, for a piece of equipment, or to get him through to harvest." "Did Daniel keep a record of those loans?" she pressed. "He kept a record of everything," I said, the words catching in my throat. "But the books are gone, Evelyn. Silas took them." Another silence. "Well," she said, her voice firm, "a man like Daniel doesn't just have one set of books. A man like that has notes. He has receipts. He has a system. You just haven't found the rest of it yet." Her words stuck with me. A system. Daniel wasn't a man for tricks or shortcuts. He believed in systems. He believed that if you did the small things right every day, the big things would take care of themselves. The farm was a system. His workshop was a system. His record-keeping had to be one too. The official notice from Silas's lawyer arrived 2 days later, a crisp, intimidating letter that made it all feel terribly final. It named a date, May 15th, 1983. I had a little over a month. Panic is a useless emotion. It's a rocking chair. Gives you something to do, but gets you nowhere. So I decided to work. I couldn't work the fields, not with this hanging over me. So I started on the house. I decided I would clean it from top to bottom. If I had to leave it, I would leave it spotless. I would touch every surface, every object, and say my goodbyes. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. It was a search. I was reading the ground, just a different kind of ground. I was looking for some other piece of Daniel's system. I started in the attic, a place of dust and ghosts and forgotten things. For 3 days, I sorted through boxes, old clothes, baby shoes from a child we'd hoped for but never had, stacks of National Geographic from the 1960s. I found letters from Daniel's time in the service, but nothing financial, nothing related to the farm. I moved to the basement with its damp, earthy smell and its shelves of preserved vegetables from harvests long past. I tapped the stone walls, checked the crawlspace. Nothing. I worked my way through the house, room by room. The spare bedroom, the living room, the pantry. Each drawer I opened, each closet I emptied, felt like a small failure. The house was getting cleaner, but my hope was getting thinner. The deadline was getting closer. I could feel the days slipping away. The thought of Silas selling this place, of strangers walking through these rooms, of Daniel's oak table being hauled off to some auction, it was a physical pain. It wasn't until the summer of 1985 that the light finally came. 2 years had passed. 2 whole years. Silas hadn't pushed me out. After the initial 30-day notice, he'd let it lie. I think he enjoyed the power of it, knowing he held the axe over my neck and could let it fall whenever he chose. He'd drive by, slow down, and just look at the house. It was a war of nerves, and he figured he was winning. I'd managed to stay by paying the property taxes myself, which the law allowed. It kept his hands tied for a time. But it was a fragile peace. During those 2 years, I never stopped looking, not really. Every time I fixed a leaky pipe or patched a piece of plaster, my hands would search the space, feeling for anything hollow, anything out of place. The discovery came on a hot, sticky afternoon in late July, a Thursday. There was a thunderstorm brewing in the west, the sky the color of a bad bruise. I was in the office, that little closet of a room, trying to fix a floorboard that had always been loose. Every time I walked over it, it gave a little groan. Daniel had always meant to fix it. I was tired of the noise. I got a pry bar from the workshop and worked it under the edge of the oak plank. It was stubborn. I put my weight into it, and with a screech of old nails, the board came up. And there it was. Underneath, in the dark, dusty space between the floor joists, was a long, flat box made of galvanized tin, the kind soldiers used for their personal effects. It was heavy. My heart started beating a fast, heavy rhythm against my ribs. I lifted it out. It wasn't locked. I carried it to the kitchen table, the very table where I'd sat that morning Silas came. My hands were trembling as I undid the 2 simple latches and lifted the lid. The air that rose from the box smelled of time itself. Dry paper, leather, and something else, something faintly metallic, like old ink. It was full, packed tight. On top was a small leather-bound journal, and tucked inside its cover was a folded piece of paper. I opened it. It was a letter in Daniel's neat, compact hand. It was dated October 1st, 1977, just 3 weeks before he died. "Martha," it began, "if you are reading this, it means I am gone, and Silas is trying to take what is ours. Do not believe him. The truth is in these books. The farm is clear. I have made sure of it. Follow the numbers. They do not lie. Remember, ink doesn't forget, but it waits for good light to be read. I love you. Daniel." I had to sit down. The words on the page blurred. He had known. He had known his brother's character, and he had prepared. He had built a final system, a fail-safe, and hidden it away. Underneath the letter were the books. Not just one set of ledgers, but everything. The main account books from 1970 all the way through 1977. There were smaller notebooks filled with daily entries, a book for tracking fuel and maintenance on the equipment, and a separate ledger just for loans and debts. There were bundles of receipts held together with twine, canceled checks and bank statements. It was the complete financial anatomy of our life together. It was Daniel's system, whole and intact. It wasn't a single trick, a hidden deed that would trump Silas's. It was something more powerful and more difficult. It was a mountain of methodical, interlocking proof. The hard part wasn't finding it. The hard part would be making someone else understand it. The next morning, I took the tin box to a lawyer in town, a man named Mr. Henderson. He was old, knew our family, and I thought he would help. He sat behind his big desk and listened patiently as I told him the story. He looked at the photocopy of Silas's deed. "This looks official, Martha," he said, tapping the paper. "It's been filed with the county. It's a matter of public record." Then I opened the tin box on his floor. I showed him Daniel's letter. I showed him the ledgers. He picked one up, flipped through it, and set it back down. "These are just farm accounts," he said, not unkindly. "They show you bought seed and sold grain. They don't have any legal standing against a recorded deed." He explained that to challenge a deed, you needed overwhelming evidence of fraud, and that was a very high bar. He said a case like this would be expensive, thousands of dollars, with no guarantee of success. He was gently telling me to give up. He was quoting me a price designed to end the conversation. I left his office feeling like I'd been punched in the stomach. The institutional check, the official word, was that my truth was worthless. That night was one of the longest of my life. I didn't sleep. I laid all of Daniel's books out on the kitchen table. They covered the entire surface. It was an intimidating sight. Mr. Henderson was right. They were just farm accounts, a collection of numbers and notes. How could this tangle of ink fight a clean, simple legal document? Doubt is a cold companion in the middle of the night. I felt the weight of those 2 years of anxiety, of Silas's smug confidence, of the town's pitying looks. Maybe I was just a foolish old woman clinging to a memory. I picked up the little leather-bound journal, the one that had been on top. I opened it to the last entry, dated the day before Daniel died. He wrote about fixing a fence in the east pasture and how a storm was rolling in. Then, at the very bottom of the page, as if it were an afterthought, he had written it again. Ink doesn't forget, but it waits for good light to be read. It wasn't a command. It was a statement of fact. It was the core principle of his system, and I realized then that I had been going about it all wrong. I wasn't supposed to fight Silas. I was supposed to bring the light. I had to stop seeing this as a legal battle and start seeing it as a job of work. The task wasn't to defeat a lie, but to reveal a truth that was already there, patiently waiting in the columns of Daniel's careful hand. I decided to trust the slow process. I would become the expert on these books. I would know them better than anyone, better even than the man who wrote them. I would make the ink speak so clearly that no one could ignore it. So began my real work. For the next year, that kitchen table was my world. I bought a magnifying glass, colored pencils, and big sheets of paper. I started with the year 1977. I went through the main ledger, page by page, and cross-referenced every single entry with the daily notebook. the receipts, and the bank statements. If the ledger said $450 for seed corn from Agway on March 15th, I would find the corresponding entry in the notebook, the carbon copy of the check, and the receipt from Agway, and I would clip them all together. Slowly, painstakingly, I was reconstructing the farm's life, week by week. It was a slow accumulation of concrete detail. I learned to recognize the slight changes in Daniel's handwriting when he was tired or when he was pleased with a good price at the grain elevator. The books were more than numbers. They were his biography. The seasons turned outside my window. The autumn of '85 gave way to the deep snows of winter. I kept the wood stove burning and worked by the light of a gooseneck lamp, the smell of coffee and old paper, my constant companions. Evelyn would bring me a hot meal every few days. She never asked how it was going. She'd just look at the growing stacks of paper, the charts I was taping to the wall, and nod. "Looks like you're making progress," she'd say. And I was. I was building a case, not for a lawyer, but for myself. I was proving it to me first. I created a timeline, a long sheet of butcher paper that stretched across the living room floor. I marked every significant event, every major transaction. The pattern that emerged was one of planning, of investment, of a man building a future, not giving one away. In February of '77, a new water pump for the well, $820. In April, a down payment on a new disc harrow, $1,500. In July, prepayment for 200 bales of hay for the winter. These were not the actions of a man secretly selling his farm. The breakthrough, the linchpin, came in March of 1986. I was working on the ledger for personal loans, a small, unassuming book bound in blue cloth. And I found it. An entry dated January 4th, 1977. Quote, 22, $2,500. A significant sum back then. I felt a jolt, a surge of adrenaline. I immediately went to the daily journal. I flipped through the pages, my fingers flying. I found the entry for the day the deed was supposedly signed, a Tuesday in late May of '77. The date was on the forged document Silas had shown me. Daniel's entry for that day was short, and his handwriting was tight. Angry. "Silas here this afternoon. Asked about the North 40. I told him no. Demanded payment on the January loan. He made excuses, left angry. That was it. That was the whole entry. He hadn't signed a deed. He had argued with his brother about an unpaid loan. Silas had twisted a day of bitter conflict into a story of brotherly generosity. The ink was finally starting to talk. Now I had more than just a feeling. I had a contradiction anchored by a specific date and a dollar amount. But I knew it still wasn't enough for a court. I needed a neutral verifier, someone from outside our little town, someone who dealt only in facts and evidence, not in family history and small-town gossip. Evelyn had a nephew who had just finished law school in the city. He wasn't a trial lawyer. He worked for a big firm that handled corporate accounts, a world away from a place like this. But she said he was smart, and more importantly, he was young and owed her a favor. His name was Mr. Davies. He agreed to come out one Saturday in April. He arrived in a car that looked as out of place as Silas's truck had. All sharp angles and polished chrome. He was young, younger than I'd expected, and wore a suit that probably cost more than my monthly budget. He had a skeptical, impatient air about him. He sat at my kitchen table, which I had cleared for his visit, and I could tell he was expecting a rambling, emotional story from a confused old woman. I didn't give him one. I didn't start with the story. I started with the system. For 2 hours, I walked him through it. I showed him the ledgers, the cross-referenced receipts, the canceled checks. I unrolled the timeline on the floor and showed him the pattern of investment. I showed him the loan entry for $2,500. And then, last, I showed him the journal entry from the day the deed was signed. I just laid the book open on the table and let him read it. I watched his face. The skepticism slowly drained away, replaced by a look of intense concentration. He spent a full 10 minutes just looking at the journal entry and the loan book, comparing the handwriting. He took out a small magnifying glass from his briefcase and examined the ink. He was no longer a big city lawyer doing a favor for his aunt. He was a professional, recognizing the work of another professional. Daniel's meticulousness was speaking to him. "The signature on the deed he filed," Mr. Davies said, looking up at me, his voice quiet. "We need to see the original, and we need to compare it to your husband's signature from this exact week." He explained that a person's signature is a product of muscle memory, but that it can be affected by mood or fatigue. A forger often tries to draw a signature, making it look perfect, but they can't replicate the natural flow, the pressure, the speed of a true signature. The slight anger in Daniel's handwriting on that specific day might be the very thing that would prove the deed a fake. Mr. Davies took the journal, the loan book, and a half-dozen other documents with him. He said he was going to hire a forensic document examiner. For the next 2 months, I heard nothing. It was a different kind of waiting. It wasn't the hopeless waiting of the first 2 years, but the tense, anxious waiting of a farmer who has planted the seed and can do nothing but watch the sky for rain. Finally, in late June, he called. "We have it," he said. The examiner's report was conclusive. The signature on the deed, when compared to a dozen other signatures Daniel had written in that same week in his journals and on his checks, was a forgery. The report noted microscopic hesitations in the ink line, inconsistent pressure, and a slope that was off by 2 degrees. Things no normal person would ever see, but to an expert, it was as clear as a confession. The examiner also confirmed that the paper and ink in Daniel's journals were consistent with the period, giving them unimpeachable authenticity. Mr. Davies had also done a title search and found no record of any lien or debt that would have justified such a transfer. The story Silas had told was a complete fabrication. The system had worked. The ink, under the bright light of forensic science, had given up its truth. The doubter's turning wasn't a single dramatic event. It happened quietly, without fanfare. Mr. Davies arranged a meeting, not in a courtroom, but in a conference room at a neutral law office in the next county over. It was just me, Mr. Davies, Silas, and his lawyer. Silas walked in with his usual confident swagger, but it vanished when he saw the folder in Mr. Davies's hands. My lawyer didn't raise his voice. He didn't make accusations. He simply laid out the facts, one by one. He presented the timeline of Daniel's investments in the farm. He presented the record of the unpaid $2,500 loan. He presented the journal entry from the day in question. And then he produced the 9-page forensic report with its magnified images of the signatures, showing the inconsistencies in the ink flow and pressure points. He just let the papers do the talking. I watched Silas's face. The color drained from it. He looked at the report, at the blown-up pictures of the signature he had so carefully practiced. He looked at his lawyer, who simply shook his head, a tiny, almost imperceptible motion. There was no outburst, no denial, just a heavy, suffocating silence. He had been so certain that his clean, official paper would beat my messy, complicated truth. But he had underestimated Daniel, and he had underestimated me. He had forgotten the first rule of this place. The ground keeps a record of everything. His lawyer spoke. He said that, in light of this new information, his client was prepared to sign a quitclaim deed, relinquishing all claim to the property, effective immediately. In return, they would ask that I not pursue criminal charges for fraud and forgery. Mr. Davies looked at me. I thought of the years of fear, the sleepless nights, the quiet humiliation. But I also thought of Daniel. He wasn't a vengeful man. He was a man who believed in setting things right. "I agree," I said. My voice was steady. It was the only thing I said in the whole meeting. Silas never looked at me. Not once. He just signed the papers his lawyer pushed in front of him, his hand shaking slightly. The concession was understated and final. He walked out of that room a smaller man than he had been when he walked in. The harvest, when it came, was not a bumper crop of cash or a dramatic victory. It was quiet. It was the feeling of walking out my front door the next morning and knowing, with the certainty that went all the way down to my bones, that it was my front door. The resolution was a set of new legal papers, filed correctly with the county, that named me as the sole and undisputed owner of the farm. The only number that mattered was the final bill from Mr. Davies. It was for $4,250, which covered his time and the cost of the forensic examiner. It was every penny I had in savings and then some, but it was the best money I ever spent. I sold a small, unused parcel of woodland to cover it, a piece Daniel had always said was more trouble than it was worth. It felt right, using a piece of the land to save the rest of it. Now, years later, I still sit at this same oak table. The light in the kitchen is warmer in the afternoons. The floorboard in the office is fixed, solid under my feet. The tin box with Daniel's ledgers sits on the shelf where the old ones used to be. I had them professionally treated to preserve the paper and the ink. They are a part of this farm now, as much as the barn or the fences. They are the foundation. My brother-in-law, Silas, he moved away a year after that meeting. I heard he sold his new truck and his land and went somewhere out west. We never spoke again. There was nothing left to say. Daniel was right. Ink doesn't forget. It just holds its breath, sometimes for years, waiting for someone to come along who is patient enough to listen, to provide the good light it needs to be read. The truth isn't always a shout. Sometimes it's a whisper, hidden in the columns of an old account book, in the slight change of pressure in a line of ink, in the patient, steady accumulation of ordinary days. You don't conquer a problem like the one I had. You manage it. You pay attention to the details. You trust the system, and you let the truth do its own work. That's the real lesson. The patience is the whole of the craft. I wonder, what stubborn ground are you trying to read in your own life? What truth is waiting patiently in the records you might have overlooked? Let me know in the comments below.